The soft hum of country music floated through the dimly lit bar, blending seamlessly with the occasional clink of glasses and the muted murmur of patrons. The Rusty Nail, a modest establishment on the outskirts of a small Midwest town, was a haven for locals seeking a break from their daily routines. Its weathered sign creaked gently in the breeze outside, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. Inside, the warm glow of vintage lanterns cast elongated shadows across walls adorned with faded photographs, and rusted license plates a testament to decades of stories etched into the wood and plaster. David Harris, a soldier recently returned from deployment, sat alone at a corner table. His frame, lean but muscular, filled out a plain grey t-shirt, paired with well-worn jeans and boots that had seen better days. Though his posture was relaxed, there was an air of quiet vigilance about him, a readiness ingrained from years of service. David's deep brown eyes scanned the room intermittently, lingering just long enough to take in his surroundings without inviting attention. The faint scar along his temple hinted at a story he rarely shared, one of countless moments that had shaped him into the man he was. He nursed a soda, the condensation from the glass pooling into a small ring on the table. For David, alcohol held no appeal tonight. He had come seeking solace, not escape. The Rusty Nail, with its creaky floors, and the occasional burst of laughter from a boisterous group, offered just enough noise to drown out the echoes of distant memories of sand, sweat, and the heavy weight of duty. The bartender, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and sharp eyes, exchanged a knowing glance with him as she wiped down the counter. David acknowledged her with a slight nod, a silent gesture of gratitude for her unobtrusive kindness. It was a mutual understanding born of familiarity. This was not his first visit here, though he came often enough to be a regular without overstaying his welcome. In the corner, a jukebox hummed to life, its colourful lights a stark contrast to the muted tones of the room. A couple by the bar swayed gently to an old tune, their laughter carrying softly over the din. It was a slice of life, simple, unassuming, and for David, grounding. The world outside might have been chaotic, but within these walls, time seemed to slow, offering a fleeting respite. But simplicity rarely lasted. Unbeknownst to David, tonight would test more than just his patience. It would challenge the very core of the principles he lived by, setting into motion a chain of events that no one in the Rusty Nail would soon forget. The metallic growl of motorcycles reverberated through the night, announcing the arrival of a group that would shatter the bar's fragile peace. Heads turned as 6 bikers strode into the Rusty Nail, their heavy boots clomping against the wooden floor. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a patch over one eye, surveyed the room with an air of practiced dominance. His leather jacket, adorned with insignias and patches, told stories of the roads he'd travelled, and the way he carried himself spoke volumes about his intentions. Behind him, the rest of the crew followed, each man exuding a blend of swagger and menace. The youngest of them, a wiry figure with a jagged scar running down his cheek, scanned the bar with a sly grin. "Nice little joint," he remarked, his voice loud enough to command attention. "Cozy." The bartender's hand paused mid-wipe on the counter. "Keep it civil, Rex," she said, her tone firm but wary. "Rex." The leader chuckled. "Always Linda. You know me." Linda's sharp eyes lingered on him for a moment before she returned to her task. The bikers dispersed, some heading toward the bar, others claiming a table near the jukebox. Their presence shifted the atmosphere, the easygoing hum of conversation replaced by a taut silence. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, sensing trouble brewing. It wasn't long before Rex's gaze landed on David. The soldier's quiet demeanor seemed to draw the leader's attention like a magnet. Well, Rex drawled, striding toward David's table. "What do we have here?" David looked up, meeting Rex's gaze with calm, measured eyes. "Just a guy enjoying a quiet evening." Rex's lips twisted into a smirk. "A quiet evening, huh? Doesn't exactly fit the soldier type. You're a soldier, right? Or is that just a fashion statement?" The room seemed to hold its breath. David's voice remained steady. "I'm a soldier." The wiry biker with the scar leaned against a nearby chair, his grin widening. "That so? Doesn't look like much of one to me. What's with the soda?" Real men drink beer. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing with each taunt. David, however, remained composed. "I'm good with what I've got." Rex pulled out a chair and sat backward on it, leaning in closer to David. "You got a name, soldier? Or are you just another face in the crowd?" "David," he replied simply. "David," Rex repeated, his tone mocking. "Well, David, you ever see any real action? Or are you one of those pencil pushers who likes to play dress up?" David's grip on his glass tightened slightly, but his expression didn't waver. "I've seen enough." The challenge in his voice was subtle, but it was there. Rex's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He leaned back, crossing his arms as if sizing David up. "You don't talk much, do you?" "I've found there's more value in listening," David replied evenly. The tension in the room thickened as the exchange continued, the bikers' laughter growing louder, more pointed. They were testing him, probing for a reaction, and while David's calm composure held steady, The night was far from over. The storm was just beginning to brew. The bar's tension simmered, every patron feeling the shift in the atmosphere as the bikers closed in on David. His calm demeanor was like a challenge, an unspoken defiance that seemed to rile Rex and his crew even further. Conversations in the background dwindled to whispers, and the bartender, Linda, moved closer, her eyes darting between the soldier and the bikers. "You don't seem too impressed with us," Rex said, dragging a chair noisily and sitting down across from David. The other bikers fanned out behind him, creating a semicircle. Their movements were deliberate, meant to intimidate. David lifted his soda and took a measured sip, his silence amplifying the unease. His eyes remained steady on Rex. "I'm not here to impress anyone." The comment was straightforward but felt like a jab to Rex, whose smirk faltered. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But see, this is our kind of place. Guys like you don't usually fit in here." David set his glass down deliberately, the faint clink echoing in the tense silence. "I'm not looking to fit in." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, let out a sharp laugh. "He's got a mouth on him. Maybe he thinks that uniform makes him untouchable." David's gaze flicked to the man briefly. Not wearing a uniform, the scarred man bristled, stepping closer. But Rex raised a hand to stop him. "Relax, Doug. Let's see what Soldier Boy here's really about." "Not much to see," David replied evenly. "Just someone trying to enjoy his evening." Rex's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy it, huh? That's cute. You know, we've got a problem with guys who think they're better than us. It's disrespectful." "Respect's earned," David said quietly, his tone devoid of malice but firm. The subtlety of the comment landed like a blow. Rex's face darkened, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Behind him, Doug snickered, and another biker, a stocky man with tattoos creeping up his neck, muttered something under his breath. The tension reached a boiling point when Rex grabbed David's glass and inspected it mockingly. "Soda? That what they teach you to drink in the army? Thought soldiers were made of tougher stuff." David leaned back slightly, his movements calm and controlled. "Drink doesn't make the man." The remark hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Rex's grin disappeared, replaced by a scowl. He slammed the glass back onto the table, spilling the remaining soda across the worn wood. "You're awful sure of yourself." "I'm sure of my values," David replied, his voice steady. The room seemed to hold its breath as Rex stood up slowly, the scrape of his chair echoing like a gunshot. His towering frame loomed over David, who remained seated, his posture unshaken. The other bikers shifted, their aggression palpable. "You think you can walk in here, sit there all high and mighty, and not show us some respect?" Rex growled. His voice was low, but the threat in it was unmistakable. "I respect those who earn it," David said, locking eyes with Rex, "not those who demand it." The patrons in the bar were frozen, their eyes darting nervously between the two men. Linda's voice broke through the tension. "That's enough, Rex. Leave him be. Stay out of this." Linda. Rex snapped, not taking his eyes off David. "This is between me and the Soldier Boy." David glanced at Linda briefly and nodded, a silent assurance that he could handle it. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, though his presence seemed to grow as he rose to his full height. He wasn't as broad as Rex, but there was an unmistakable air of strength and control about him. "You looking for a fight?" Rex sneered, stepping closer. "Because I've got no problem giving you one." "I'm not looking for trouble," David said evenly, his tone calm but firm. "But I won't back down if it comes to me." Doug let out a sharp whistle. "Ooh, he's got some fight in him after all." The group of bikers closed ranks, and the patrons began to edge toward the door, sensing the situation was about to explode. Linda grabbed the phone behind the bar, her hand hovering over the keypad. "Careful, Rex," David said, his voice low and measured. "You don't want to start something you can't finish." The challenge in David's tone wasn't loud, but it struck like a hammer. Rex's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He stepped closer until he was inches away from David. "Big words for a guy all by himself." "I've faced worse odds," David replied, his voice steady. The bikers laughed, but the sound was forced, masking their unease. There was something unnerving about David's composure, a quiet confidence that spoke of experience they couldn't comprehend. Rex made the first move, shoving David hard in the chest. The room seemed to freeze as David staggered back a step, but didn't fall. He straightened, his gaze locked on Rex. "Last warning," he said softly. "Don't do it again." Rex scoffed and swung a fist, but David moved like water, sidestepping the punch with practiced ease. In one fluid motion, he caught Rex's arm and twisted it, forcing the larger man off balance. The bar erupted into chaos as the bikers lunged toward David, but he was ready. Each movement was calculated, efficient. David didn't lash out with unnecessary aggression, he simply neutralized each threat as it came. Doug lunged with a broken bottle, but David disarmed him with a swift strike to his wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. The tattooed biker swung wildly, but David ducked and countered with a shove that sent the man sprawling into a table. The patrons watched in stunned silence as David handled the situation with precision. He didn't escalate the violence, he controlled it, his training evident in every motion. When Rex finally regained his footing and charged, David sidestepped again, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into the bar. By the time the scuffle ended, the bikers were either on the floor or backing away, their bravado shattered. David stood in the center of the room, breathing steadily but otherwise unscathed. He glanced at Linda, who nodded in silent approval, and dialed the police. The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. David's voice broke the stillness. "Anyone else want to test me?" No one moved. The rusty nail was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the confrontation leaving the air thick with tension. The bikers, now scattered across the room, wore varying expressions of shock and indignation. Rex, the leader, sat slumped against the bar, his pride more battered than his body. Despite the scuffle, David's breathing was steady, his posture calm and resolute. He stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding without being overtly threatening. Doug, the wiry man with the scar, picked himself up off the floor, cradling his wrist where David had disarmed him moments ago. His face twisted in anger as he glanced at Rex, who gave him a sharp nod. It was a silent order to continue the fight, a desperate attempt to reclaim the dominance they had lost. Doug lunged again, this time without a weapon, his fists swinging wildly. David sidestepped effortlessly, his movements a seamless blend of control and precision. Grabbing Doug's arm mid-swing, he twisted it behind the man's back, forcing him to his knees. "Enough," David said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want this." But the bikers weren't ready to concede. The tattooed man, still dazed from being shoved into a table earlier, staggered to his feet and rushed at David. This time David shifted his weight, pivoting on his heel to avoid the charge. In one fluid motion, he extended his arm, guiding the man's momentum and sending him stumbling into Rex. Rex caught his companion but pushed him aside roughly, rising to his feet with a growl. His one good eye burned with fury as he wiped a trickle of blood from his split lip. "You think you're better than us?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can walk in here and make us look weak?" David turned to face him fully, his expression unwavering. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, but I won't let you disrespect me or anyone else without standing my ground." Rex let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you don't know who you're dealing with." David's response was measured, his tone as steady as his stance. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, men who think fear is power, but real power doesn't need to intimidate." The room seemed to hold its breath again as Rex squared his shoulders, his fists clenching. This time he didn't rush in blindly. Instead, he circled David, his movements calculated, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You talk a big game, soldier boy. Let's see if you can back it up." David didn't flinch, his eyes tracking Rex's movements carefully. His military training was evident in his composed stance, his weight balanced, his muscles coiled like a spring. When Rex lunged, his attack was faster and more deliberate than before, but David was ready. He blocked the punch with his forearm, stepping into Rex's space and delivering a swift elbow to his ribs. The blow was controlled, enough to hurt but not to cause lasting damage. Rex stumbled back, coughing as the air was knocked out of him. Yet he didn't retreat. Instead, he roared in frustration and came at David again, this time with a wide swing. David ducked, grabbing Rex's arm and using his momentum to flip him over onto the floor. The crash echoed through the bar, drawing gasps from the remaining patrons. Linda, who had been standing near the phone, finally intervened. "Enough," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "The police are on their way. If you've got any sense left, you'll stop this now." The mention of the police seemed to jolt the bikers. Doug and the others hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Rex, still on the floor, glared up at David with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect, but he didn't move to attack again. David stepped back, giving Rex room to stand. He didn't offer a hand to help him up, but his posture wasn't aggressive. "You've made your point," David said evenly. "It's over." Rex climbed to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at David for a long moment, as if trying to decipher the man who had bested him so effortlessly. Finally, he spat on the floor, his expression hardening. "This ain't over," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Before anyone could respond, the wail of sirens pierced the tense silence. Red and blue lights flashed outside the bar's windows, and moments later, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Their eyes immediately took in the disheveled bikers, the overturned chairs, and David standing calmly in the center of it all. "What's going on here?" one of the officers demanded, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. Linda stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos. "There was a fight. These bikers started it, but David stopped it before anyone got seriously hurt." The officers turned to David, their expressions skeptical. "And you are one of them?" asked. David reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his military ID. Sergeant David Harris, United States Army. The room fell silent again as the officers inspected the ID. One of them nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "We'll take it from here," he said, turning to Rex and his crew. "You're all coming with us." The bikers didn't resist, their earlier bravado extinguished. As they were led out of the bar one by one, Rex shot a final glare at David, but this time there was no threat in his eyes, only a grudging acknowledgement of defeat. As the door swung shut behind the officers and their unruly charges, the rusty nail seemed to exhale collectively. Patrons returned to their seats, murmuring in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed. David sat down at his table, his soda long forgotten, and let out a slow, steady breath. Linda approached him cautiously, a faint smile on her lips. "You handled that well," she said. "Most people wouldn't have stayed as calm as you did." David shrugged lightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Violence doesn't solve anything, but sometimes you have to stand your ground to make a point." Linda nodded, her respect for him evident. "Well, I think you made your point loud and clear." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the door, where the bikers had disappeared moments ago. A faint shadow of concern flickered across his face. Tonight might have ended peacefully, but he knew the battle against ignorance and hatred was far from over. Still, he resolved to face it with the same integrity and strength that had guided him so far. As the flashing red and blue lights receded into the night, the rusty nail began to return to its usual rhythm. Chairs were righted, glasses refilled, and conversations cautiously resumed. Yet the energy of the room remained different, charged with the echoes of the confrontation that had just unfolded. Eyes occasionally darted toward David, whose calm presence now carried an undeniable weight of respect. David remained at his table, his expression thoughtful. The bartender, Linda, brought him a fresh soda without a word, setting it down with a quiet nod of acknowledgement. "Thanks," David said, his voice low but sincere. Moments later, the bar's door creaked open again, and the room collectively stiffened. It wasn't the bikers returning, but a lone figure, Doug, the wiry man with the scar. He stepped inside hesitantly, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. For a moment, his gaze swept the room before landing on David. The bar fell silent as Doug approached David's table, each step deliberate and weighed. Linda stood alert behind the counter, but David raised a hand, signaling her to let the moment play out. Doug stopped a few feet away, his eyes downcast, the earlier bravado in his demeanor completely stripped away. Doug began, his voice unsteady. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said, for what we did. It was wrong." David studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But it's not me you need to change for. It's for yourself." Doug swallowed hard, his scarred face reflecting a mixture of shame and relief. "I'll think about that," he muttered before turning and leaving as quietly as he had come. The room seemed to exhale again, and David leaned back in his chair, his quiet strength speaking louder than any words. The night grew quieter as patrons slowly filtered out of the rusty nail, returning to their lives with a story they would share for years to come. David remained seated, savoring the stillness. The conflict had passed, but its echoes lingered not in anger or triumph, but in reflection. Linda approached his table one last time, her usual sharp demeanor softened by the events of the evening. "You sure know how to keep your cool," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. David offered her a small smile. "You learn a thing or two in my line of work." "More people could use that kind of patience," Linda said, setting down the check. "I don't know if it's my place, but I think you changed something tonight." David shrugged lightly, his humility evident. "Maybe, but real change doesn't happen overnight. People have to want it." As David prepared to leave, the sound of footsteps stopped him. Turning, he saw one of the patrons, an older man in a plaid shirt, approach. The man extended a hand, his expression earnest. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice steady. David shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that." Outside, the cool night air greeted him as he stepped into the quiet street. The sky was a deep expanse of stars, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. Doug's apology replayed in his mind, a small yet significant step toward redemption. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As David walked to his truck, he glanced back at the bar, the faint glow of its sign flickering in the darkness. The rusty nail had been a battlefield of sorts tonight, but it was also a place where the seeds of understanding had been sown. And for David, that was enough.